For Father, we accept the fact that we all live, Father God, hidden under your hand, Heavenly Father. You put your words, Father God, into our mouths for us, Father God, to survive this journey of life, oh Heavenly Father. A journey, Lord God Almighty, that you decided we should have, and that our role, Father God, in it is to obey your direction, Heavenly Father. In the name of Jesus, amen. Before I go further, let me introduce this beautiful couple before you. This handsome young man goes by the name of Mthunzi Kakwempe. Yeah, and with me is Bukelwa Kakwempe, my beautiful wife of 16 years. Hallelujah, my beautiful wife of 16 years. Yeah, I think I should hand over to her to carry the program forward.
Good afternoon, couples. We are standing here to welcome everyone, and a special welcome to our guest speakers. We also welcome our leaders, the leaders of the church. Do we have couples that are coming here for the first time? We'd like to welcome couples that are joining us for the first time. Kuthiwa bakhona but abatsho bona.
We've got chocolates here. This chocolate will not walk to you. Please come, collect your chocolate. And because you need to introduce yourself also. Lavi. Okay, we need to know who they are so that when we see them coming down Oxford Street, we can even stop the car in hood and give them a hug.
Ladies first. So.
Lord. Jabulisa kumntu wonke olapha ngegama lika Yesu, igama lam ndingiyamkela Nkomo, and this is my fiance. We live here in Southern Ranch.
Okay. Molweni ngokulingana nonke. Igama lam nguSikhokelo Sukaliwe. Siyavuya uba lapha.
Afternoon, everyone. This is the Bum family, original from Mthatha Kopane, but guess reside up at Greenfields, Sunny Ridge. And this is my lovely, beautiful wife, Pila Mekwe.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are the Dlela Pansi family. My name is Tano. I'm with my beautiful wife and blessed with a son as well. Upumeza.
Thank you, couples. We welcome you.
Yeah, Nick speaker now. It's the first time this time. And he's brought his beautiful wife here. And we want him to come back here again next time.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matabe Mlilo, and I'm with my exquisite wife here next to me. I heard beautiful so many times. I thought, let me break this thing, and just up it a notch,
Molweni bethuna, my name is Phelela Mlilo, married to this fellow.
This charming fellow for 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'd like to celebrate with the couples that were married in October. If any couple got married in October, even if your anniversary has not yet come, but October couples, we invite you on the stage. The auditorium doesn't allow us to do as we usually do. So, happy anniversary.
We're not robbing a bank here.
Nivuleke chom. Chocolate. Eh?
You know, Mos, you know the thrill. On the trail. You take a nice piece, put it in your mouth or in his mouth, and then you find it.
We beso uyoyilanda mama.
There's no time for playing holy here. Yeah, that's taken care of the introductions and stuff. As we all know, we've got. Hey, this guy is wearing many hats. He's a pastor. He's an attorney. He's a marriage officer. He's a husband. A writer. Wow. What else? He's also a father. He's also a father. And an athlete also. And an athlete because I know he spent some time doing rugby. But of late I've seen a video of him. He was punching that punching bag like it owed him money. So, so he was trying to extract a lot out of that session. Yeah. Without further ado, I will call upon Pastor Lwazi. We know him here. He needs no further introduction other than the one that I've just done, so that he can introduce Mr. ngubani kanene? Fire, fear in Afrikaans. Yeah, because they've got some valuable, I don't want to call it lessons for us, advice, some valuable advice that we all need. In the African communities, even the issue of funeral insurance, it took a lot of time, a long time for it to really gain traction. Because people thought if you take a policy, then it means you want to die. But it's not like that. You are taking this policy so that because we were all going to die someday, all of us. So we need just to take care of our affairs. When we cannot speak for ourselves, when we don't have money, the policies start paying and the funeral goes on and some of it is left for your children. It's the same thing with people doing financial planning and estate planning. People want to delay that, and it doesn't really make sense because none of us know when they're going to die. Even in our practice as attorneys, people come. You find that this guy, he had 5 buses, he had several condoms, he had cattle. He's got a child with Cindy, so one with Unompumelelo, another one Uxolelwa, and a wife and 6 other kids. His affairs are not in order. And this one girlfriend comes, he takes a bus because he needs food to pay for money to pay for food and school fees for his children. And in such chaotic situations, blood sometimes gets spilled because people are angry. And greed also creeps in. So these 2 gentlemen are here today to at least give us some, of what we need to do so that when we drop dead someday, our affairs will be in order. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Mbuti Mthunzi. We are the undertakers. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak to you this afternoon. When I was thinking about today and what we're going to share with Matt, I'll introduce him in a moment. I was thinking, what happened in the book of Genesis. The first thing that we learn about God is what? Is that God is a God of structure, He's a God of order, He's a God of systems, and that everything that He does, He designs it for life to flow. And I think as born-again believers as well, as children of God, we have a responsibility to ensure that even in our own lives, we mirror the heart of the Father, that we make sure that our things are in order, they're well-structured, and they're put in place. Because as Mthunzi says, you come into a situation as attorneys and you receive clients and you consult with them when someone has passed on. And all of a sudden, there is a crisis that could have been avoided with good planning. But we're not only talking about death, though, today. We are also talking about how we can maximize our resources even during the course of life so that we can enjoy them, so that we can maximize them. So that's what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce a friend of mine, or friends of mine, actually, because they are a couple. I've known this couple for many years. We started out, I think, early 2000s. I used to share a flat with this young man. Well, we were bachelors then. That's a story for another day. But yeah, so we work together. Ubuntu Mthunzi already mentioned that I wear many hats. And one of the hats that I wear, part of what is called the MAPAC group. MAPAC Estate Planning is the entity that I run as a director, of which MAPAC Financial Solutions, which is another company, is run by Matt, has a share in MAPAC Estate Planning. So that's part of one of the hats that I wear. I know on the poster they had my law firm there, but I'm not there here in that capacity this afternoon. Though you're welcome to bring all your transfers and everything that you need done, it's all right. But yeah, so what we do is really responding to a need that is out there in society. And that's a need to help our people to build not only for the present, but to build for future generations to come as well. Because as we live our lives, whatever we do in the present is projecting for the future. So it's so very important that we live with a generational perspective in mind and not just live for the moment. So Matt is going to be talking about financial wellness. I'm going to be talking about estate planning. And we trust really that you're going to enjoy what we are going to be talking about, and you're going to learn something. We'll take questions, I think, at the end. But as I was saying, sorry, I keep on all around, but Matt runs an entity called MAPAC Financial Solutions. In fact, by Kalbawai to Pelela, but Pelela since he moved on to another company. So we are based in Nahoon in Beach Road, and the practice has been around, or the company has been around for what, Matt? Since 2014, yeah, so it's well established. It services individuals, also services SMMEs, which is small and medium enterprises. And yeah, so I'm sure he's going to tell you a little bit more about that, but they're married, they've got 3 wonderful children, so he's one up on me on that one, but I'm not going to catch up, sorry. He's busy. He's a busy man. Yeah, so without further ado, I'm going to call upon Matt, and he's going to be taking us through financial planning. Dago, if you can put on that slide, I just want to double check my keypad here if it's responding. I think sometimes by no issue at distance. Okay, if it's got troubles, then you just move it for us, Dago, then. Can you go start at the first slide, the holding slide? Can we put our hands together and just welcome Matt to the stage?
Thanks a lot, Pastor Lwazi. It'll take a bit of getting used to. I know him anyway. All is a tough act to follow. I mean, I always choose to speak first, you know, and I realize this podium is Lwazi's element. I mean, he flows, so it's difficult to sort of follow after what that short stint, you know, can get your heart and your blood pumping proper. And you think, jeepers, I still need to follow up on this one. Folks, thank you very much, man, for allowing us to come through today. I think just perhaps to even explain the name Maypac and how it started, Lwazi just mentioned that the business started in 2014. In fact, we licensed in 2014, but we actually started the registration of the company, I think, in 2006, somewhere there, 2006, 2007. And how it happened is through this madness here, BE and tender. If anyone is in the tendering, business, I'm not undermining it. I'm just saying. So a friend of mine, calls me up and says, "Listen, man, why don't you just open up a company? Because when we are submitting, we want to submit 3 companies, and your company must be one of those." I'm like, "Geez, okay, well, that sounds great. I mean, just to get paid for doing absolutely nothing, who would say no to that?" So the name is Matabe. So MA is Matabe, PHE Pelela, and Q was our son Kaman. And so when we had more children, we needed to figure out which letters we will give them out of the business so that they don't feel left out the day they realize that the name was actually formed, out of the unit. So I had to let go of A for Akanye, and Pelela had to let go of E for Elotando. And so that makes up the company. So people often ask, what does it mean? It means nothing, really. I mean, whatever you want it to mean, So we get called Mapeku, we get called Maypac, we get called Mapec, I'm like, whatever you want to call it, just bring the business. That's all we need. We're not going to be arguing about, the pronunciation of this name and so on. So that's the start of it. I started in the industry around, in fact, banking days when I stayed with Lwazi, moved on to insurances in 2005, working for Liberty. Much later, I worked for Discovery. And in all of those times, in fact, I'm in Standard Bank, I recall winning top awards, Liberty, top 3 in the country, Discovery, again, I was with them for 3 years. In all the 3 years that I was with them, top consultant and everything. So eventually, you get to a stage where you realize you're good at this, right? Without any arrogance coming through, but rather realizing the potential that is in you, and needing to step out and actually create this thing for yourself as opposed to, somebody else. Because this thing about corporates, every year targets are set up. Next year we're starting from 0, and then you have to push again. And you think to yourself, if I was actually bringing in X amount of business next year, I shouldn't be starting from 0. I would just simply be building on that. And so that's where the idea really, flowed from. And I was I was blessed and fortunate to have such a partner, who's walked the road with me. I think our careers have just always been parallel. When I was at Liberty, Upelela was at Stanlib. When I left for Discovery, she went and joined Itala as a development finance, manager. And then from there, that's when we started the business. But ultimately, she's working for Sanlam right now. And so we share a common, there's a common commonality. That's right. Just come closer so that I can just keep nudging. And the reason why I'm mentioning this thing is not to brag, but it's just to give you insight in terms of the experience and in terms of our thought process, that this is our language and it's something that we speak about. More than that, the story that I'm going to share at a later stage about growing up as well gave me more insight in needing to be in the space that I'm in right now. And so as we talk, understand that yes, we are qualified to do this, but most importantly, we speak from the heart because it's something that we are passionate about. It's something that we have lived. It's something that we have gone through and seen others as well going through, the mistakes and giving us the platform to actually rewrite some of the wrongs. And that's what qualifies us to stand here in front of you. And so without further ado, how am I going to do it? Do you want me to? Okay. Must I say next? Okay. So if you can give us the next slide. We are a level 1 triple BEE company. As Ulwazi has said, we have quite a few entities within the business. Maypac is a holding company. We recently merged with another company called EFS, Executive Financial Services. Chantal and I, met up to try and enlarge, or rather to try and make sure that our boundary is enlarged. So Chantal focuses on short-term insurance. That is cover for your assets, cars. If you are in the tendering business or construction, all risk cover, public liabilities, and so forth. So professional indemnities, and those are the things that we cover under short term. So that covers our services. And then long-term insurance is what I'll touch on today. That is basically medical aids, pension, provident fund structures. It would be life policies, and so on. And then, of course, Lwazi, then looks after the estate planning department. And so our core business is looking after corporates. That's our target. Part of that target was based on the fact that we had seen that businesses that are able to, to survive in our industry are ones that focus on ongoing income, or annuity income as we call it. My mentor used to say to me, when I ventured into, when I stepped out of Standard Bank, Discovery and starting the business, he used to say to me, you need to get to a point where you're sitting at your desk for free. So in other words, whether you're there or not, business can continue. And business doesn't have to always rely on you. If you miss 2-3 weeks of business, things mustn't fall apart. And that's the structure and the systems that Ulwazi was mentioning or was talking to. And we found that in our industry, there's very few black individuals or business owners that have mastered that. So the idea was for sustainability, so that we can actually spend more time doing the things that we love doing, and that is targeting individuals, if it makes sense. And so our passion is around education. We could never focus on educating you, taking you, allowing that process to flow, because sometimes it can take months to close a deal. And this is why you always find that when a broker speaks to you, they're in a hurry, right? And because they want to close a deal right now, you have a target in your forehead, and that is commission, right? And so the advice element can sometimes be put aside, and the focus could be on how much can I make out of you. Does it make sense? And so that's why we chose then to focus on corporates, so that we can actually invest a lot of time in you and take you through the process of educating you around financial wellness. And so I won't go through everything that's there. The training and facilitation element really stems from what we are doing today. And speaking to people and giving them information. We run seminars where we invite fund managers to come and give you a breakdown on how, funds are performing, what the market is doing, understanding in depth, in fact, the choices that we make when we vote and put people in power, where in turn, some decisions that they make have a direct impact on us. Who remembers when the change year VAT from 14% to 15%, how it killed us? But we didn't realize this, right? Because, it didn't change much, but when you realize the inflationary effect, where the cost of bread is suddenly now rocketed. I mean, we used to pay, what, 8 rands, 9, or whatever, and now suddenly you're paying close to about 20 rands for a loaf of bread or milk. I might be exaggerating. But the idea you get, right? And these are decisions that are made sometimes by those that we put in power. Does it make sense? And so it's important for us to always make sure that we can invite those that know to give you information on how things, politics affect, investments or markets and so forth. Does it make sense? Okay. So now, just to give you a bit of background, again, as I said, I grew up in Queenstown, born and raised Queenstown, raised by a single parent. My mother, and I have 4 siblings actually, so the 4th one, not that I've forgotten, but a cousin, and that grew up with us. My mother had this, my wife would say, this magnanimous heart, big heart, that I don't remember not having a cousin staying with us at some point or the other whilst Dtcc, and from a single income, you know what I mean? So you can imagine how tough things must have been. To a point where I share this joke and say, anytime you wanted anything from Mama, pair of shoes, whatever the case may be, she will give you her income, or rather her pay slip, and she will give you indleko zakhe, her expenses, liabilities, and everything. And she would say to me, if uzayifumana ichinji mntanam uzispoile uziqengqe. Of course, we understand what that means, that in today's term, my mother was running the show on an insolvent status for the longest time, meaning to her liabilities all as far outweighed the income that was coming in. But one of the key things that I took notice of, and remembering now that I'm in the industry and getting an opportunity to actually see these pay slips that people have, is a list and a breakdown of all Mutual, Sanlam, Metropolitan, and all of these things out of her salary. Pasal allows you to have deductions come off your pay slip of up to about 15% of your salary, right? Now, if you work out 15%, that's a lot of money, and all you're doing is just paying for insurances. And not only that, realize that out of her bank account as well, there are other debit orders that are taken off, you know what I mean, that are focused on insurance. So you could find yourself in a situation where you're actually paying probably close to about 30% of your salary just towards insurances. And not only that, it's the wrong choice that is made as well, where if you dig deep and actually look at the policies, you'll find that it's funeral policies. I used to make a joke, you have 5 funeral policies as if you're going to die 5 times. Right? The reason why that's the case is us. It's us as brokers, as I had mentioned earlier, that when we come to you, we're not concerned about consolidating your portfolio. We're not concerned about looking at what your needs are and finding a product that's going to match those needs. We are concerned about how much we can make out of you. And therefore, we pile more policies on top of other policies and so forth, ending up to a scenario where, in fact, if you take a closer look at what you have, it's not even structured correctly. Does it make sense? Now, somebody passes on, and all they had were funeral policies. And you wonder, they used to live, Ulazi will share a story about his upbringing. Living a life at this pace, suddenly when the dad or somebody is not there anymore, lifestyle changes, right? And we are forced to kind of, and figure out how we're going to survive. Some even end up in positions where they have to sell an asset in order for the kids to survive. So that's what we're about. We're about making sure that we can rewrite the wrongs that are done, one, by our industry or people in our industry. If you look at even the providers, your Discoveries and whoever, they don't make products because they're concerned or worried about you. They make products because they want to make a profit. right? And so you will hear somebody talking and Gleninisa on a product instead of actually finding a solution to your problem. And that's why we are independent. So us being independent means that we have contracts with different companies so that when we sit down with you, we're not only selling Discovery, we're not only selling Liberty. In fact, that is the last thing on our minds. What's important for us is to understand your financial position and see what product we can match or attach to your need. Does it make sense? So this is the full circle of financial understanding as we know it, right? If you could, number one, I earn a salary and I budget or pay debt. We're going to talk more around that issue of debt. And the reason we find ourselves unable to actually even move to the next stage of saving and investing because all we are doing with our salary is paying debt. We receive our salary, we pay debt. At the end of the month, we don't even have that 10% to kind of just scramble around and entertain ourselves, let alone investing. So when you start talking to people about investing, you'll invest. And when you look at their situation, you find, jeepers, the commitments that we have, and we have built those commitments. And part of that reason, I often say, Guti, we're a culture or a generation of instant gratification. We want things and we want them now. The microwave generation, right? We don't have time to be putting away $100 every single month because I want to save for the plasma screen. But I want to go to, whichever company that sells this plasma screen. I'm showing my age. Hey, it's LCD now, huh? Not plasma. We want this thing, and so we will go to this company that sells it to ensure that we have it now. And so we put on more debt, and the cycle continues. And eventually, before we know it, it's difficult for us to it's a death spiral. Difficult for us to get out of. Imagine people retiring, and by the time they reach retirement, they're debt, they're up to here with debt. And when they retire, you'll find that they still want to take more debt. That's insane thinking that when I retire, suddenly I can afford a Mercedes-Benz. When I couldn't afford a Mercedes-Benz with 100% of his salary, and at retirement, considering that the replacement ratio is now at 75% of my salary, and now I'm earning 75% of what I used to earn. But I don't pay off debt. Why? Because we have built this psyche, or we have built this thing in our minds that debt is good, debt is terrible. And we need to get out of that. And the only way you can is through planning. So we went through quite a tough time. My wife and I, Ulwazi, when he said we shared a flat, he actually used to rent Apagum. So I owned my first property when I was, 22, 23. Somewhere there. And by the time we're done, I think collectively, my wife and I, we probably had, four properties put together. And all of that at some point just, came off. The wheels fell off. We were up to here with debt. And how we did it, back in the days, remember, before they introduced the National Credit Act, you could go to any bank and actually just give them your pay slip and then they'll give you the loan. You could go to another bank, they're not going to be worried about the fact that you've got another bond elsewhere and affordability and and so forth. So you will get another bond. And so the cycle continued. It was a good thinking, but it lacked mentorship, it lacked coaching. Somebody who's going to, be on my side and say, okay, maybe 4 is too much, 3 for now, based on the fact that your salary is at this level. Because when it happened, that at Liberty, when I left Liberty, we went from earning, I think at 26, 27, somewhere roughly there. I went from earning 60,000 net. You can imagine I was bawling. I was like the cheese, right? 60,000 net to owing Liberty monies, because at the time, and how things suddenly changed was because Liberty bought Capital Alliance, who bought Rentmeester, so the systems changed and it affected us as people who were selling the product. Cut the long story short, it resulted in an issue where now suddenly I don't have an income and so I can't pay for my properties, right? Resigned, went to Joburg, tried a few things. Bottom line, and where I'm heading is that at some point, we were sitting at probably close to 200,000 owing Forget the fact that we had to sell properties so that we can actually take, capital to pay off certain things, and. I remember we had a spreadsheet, my wife and I, a matrix that we used, and we knew, Guti, from this time, this is how much we owe, and every month what comes in, we will contribute towards that loan. We've negotiated with the banks. We've done everything necessary to ensure that we can actually honor our debt. And at the end of it, I remember us sitting there cutting our credit cards and making sure that we don't have a single debt or credit, so to this day, we don't have any accounts. And thank God, the only debt that we have is a bond and our cars. But bigger than that, we've had to go through that process of learning, but fortunately having somebody who can actually educate us and tell us the way to go. So here's where I'm heading with the story. When we have an issue with the law, we've got lawyers that we can call up, right? When we have an issue with, health, we've got a family doctor that we can call up. But when we have an issue, or rather when it comes to finances, we don't always have anyone in our corner that can educate and mentor us and coach us the right way. Does it make sense? And often, than not, you'll find that we just wing it. We don't even budget. So we can scratch that part, budgeting, because we don't, right? Because all we do is actually wait for in conduct. If salary I'm getting it tomorrow, the first thing that we do is to wake up and see available balance, or by 18, and then from there we know, okay, I get to good, I've got 2,000, so all debit orders have come off, this and that. That's our form of budgeting. That's our form of budgeting. So we are driving these cars without a proper dashboard. We don't know if you fuel here to say Zaupela or anything, but siyaqhuba nje, siyahamba. And by some chance, if that light comes on, we kind of slow down a little bit, right? Just to make it, because month end is coming just now. Month end is coming just now. So that's the position that we are in as individuals. We don't budget. We pile up, so much with debt. And the idea is actually to have a plan, as Razi had said. Sit down and write everything that you have a target and have a date that by the end of this section, I want my, this to be paid off. If I want something, and let's get out of this mindset of wanting to compare ourselves with the Joneses next door. Right? If I don't have a plasma screen, I'm going to say it again. If I don't have a plasma screen, I don't have it. And I've survived thus far without it. What's another, thank you. Jeez, is it the lights? Okay, thank you. Thanks. What's another 2 years, or what's another year, actually, just to wait? And more times than not, you probably find that waiting gives you perspective and you get to understand that I actually didn't need this thing. Does it make sense? And you would have actually sat down and planned properly and make sure that you can buy whatever you need cash and don't have to depend on debt, because this is the thing about hire purchase. Now, a quick story again. When I started working at Standard Bank, I remember, thinking I didn't look like I do now, right? I didn't have any clothes for work, nothing, and I'm thinking, how am I going to do this thing, right? So as you come out of Standard Bank, those that know Queenstown, straight after, as you put your foot on the road, there's Truett's right in front of you. And the Truett's is up. He is upward. And the first thing I did was to obviously open an account. So I opened this account in the wall, like 3,000 rands, right? I've got credit for 3,000 rands. My salary is 3,000 rands, by the way. Can you see already, I've committed my entire salary to debt. But the way that we calculate it is based on how much am I going to repay. Not necessarily on, do I need this thing now? Can I not wait it out and actually just go buy a pair of pants now and, right? And so what happens is that I pay off 500 rands to try and reduce this debt, but the more I pay, the more they increase the debt. Now suddenly I have an available balance of 5,000. I'm thinking, gee, because I'm balling. That's how they attract you. That's how they attract you. And it's the power of the mind. You kind of almost have to shift something in your mind, to say no. To say no, because again, just as you think, no matter, there's a crack in the ceiling. Suddenly, you're getting direct access sending you a check for 100,000 that you can get a loan for 100,000. You're thinking, ban bonenjan. bayazilapha ndifuna kanye le 100,000 so that I can go fix the crack in the. Do you know what I'm saying? That's how we get into it. So Lwazi will tell you. I mean, he does a brilliant, and I'm sure he's done it. Mind power. So attracting the things that, you know what I mean. So suddenly now, if I wanted to buy a white car, AT&T, I'm seeing this car every single time. Playing with my mind and making me think, no man, confirmation. Yeah, we're getting as believers, right? Confirmation to clear theater. Right? That's what we do. That's what we do. And we pile up debt after debt and we cannot get out of it. I'm going to try and move past that because I'm passionate about that part because I suffered growing up. Purely because of debt. Purely because of wrong choices. In products that my mother, you can imagine consolidating that 15% of your contribution towards insurances. Why is a change? I would have been able to have a pair of techies, a pair of techies. But the choices she made resulted in me, I don't know how many times I was kicked out of school because school fees were not paid. I cannot tell you how many times that has happened. Why? Wrong choices. Wrong choices. You have the ability now to change that. You have the ability to change that. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about insurances and whatever, but the idea, this is about financial wellness, right? And so this point really, really sits heavy in my heart. The second thing that we could think about, this is our understanding. The second thing would be saving or investing, if we understand the difference. Saving is putting money under your pillow. It doesn't grow. No interest. Investing is ensuring that that money actually grows. Does it make sense? And the second thing, if we have low change layer, we would be able to dabble in some investments or, saving and so forth. And then the next thing that we would look at is insurances. Retirement comes, and if we even think about retirement. The story of our lives, it's almost like Tina singabantu who enjoy uthengi like ipacket. Kubona like ipacket, I wonder kondo namhlanje. And we only realize when it's too late. I know I'm reaching retirement at age 60. Why not plan now to start contributing towards retirement now? So that at retirement, I don't have a surprise. I wonder, nobody is draw. Does it make sense? Shocking, statistic is that only 6% of South Africans retire financially independent. 6%. Because we don't plan. We're not thinking about it. And if we are lucky, we will understand some story around estate planning, which is what Lwazi is going to, talk about. In actual fact, the full circle of financial understanding should be the next slide. Number one, we've talked about, budgeting, receiving your salary, and budget. I'm not going to teach you on how to budget. I mean, the time is pilaguyo. It's so easy for us to access these things. You Google, you'll get a budget plan immediately and find something that's going to work for you. But bottom line, the point I'm trying to make is that make it a habit. Make it a habit to budget. Draw a dashboard as you're driving your car, right? So that you can understand, gauge Yakuba, Ipina, where are you and where do you want to go, type of thing. The second thing that we should do is actually look at insurance. So what I've done is switched it. The previous slide is how you understand, financial, the financial circle to be. And this slide is how I want you to understand it. So change it. Insurance is probably your biggest asset is your income. So why not protect it? Does it make sense? Your biggest your biggest asset is your income. Why not protect it? If I were to be disabled, I'm driving this fancy car, something happens, boom. Number one, I don't even have a medical aid. Driving a fancy car like that, I don't have a medical aid, and something happens to me, do you know what I mean? That's how we operate. So we drive desires there are largely on materials, right? Versus actually just taking stock of, if you're earning any income, you've got to protect it. If I'm disabled, I must be able to have something that will pay me an income when I cannot go to my 9 to 5. That's what insurances are about. That's what medical aid is there for, to ensure that you get the best level of cover when you need it the most. I sound like one of those, insurance ads. Best cover when you need it the most. and so, insurance, and we'll go on to, the next slide will show you how to structure your insurance plans or policies, or what is important, what comes first. Because people talk about retirement, we talk about medical aid, but what do I start with? And the next slide is going to show us that. No, don't go in yet. And the next thing that you should be doing is actually considering that I am going to retire. Just like I understand that I'm going to die and I need to plan for my death, I am going to retire. And therefore I need to plan for my retirement and make sure that I'm putting something away now. That when I get to age 55, or it's not a surprise for me. And my replacement in rands, naturally we work on 75% of your replacement ratio, which means 7,500 rands is what I should be aiming as a goal, right, at retirement. And I need to, when you sit down, in fact, I didn't introduce Zizo, which you probably know very well. Zizo actually heads up the personal financial planning, within MAPAC. Do you understand, Zizo Bagmon? So while my focus is on corporates, Zizo actually heads up this department. So when you do call us up, likelihood is that you will meet up with Zizo and her team, and they'll be able to sort of draft, a good financial plan for you. And so that's the idea around what Zizo would then do is to say, if the target is 7,500 rands at retirement, how much do I need to start putting away today in order for me to achieve that goal? And given what we don't know, that after retirement, how long am I going to live for? And so they will use certain assumptions that if it's 20 years, then this is how much you need to start putting away now in order for you to achieve that goal and so forth. Does it make sense? But start now. Start as early as you can. The next thing is obviously savings. We're passionate about savings because, and investments. In fact, investment for me, I'll take out the saving element. One of the key things that I despise, and I guess it comes from my experience with my mother's payslip, is funeral policies. I cannot stand funeral policies. And funerals board. Because these things are designed for us. As I say us, then for black people mostly. Right? Have you seen a white person having 20 funeral policies? Even when they show these ads on TV, it's actually black people that are selling it. To who? To us. To our own kind. Do you remember when I said earlier that these insurance companies are not generally, interested in your well-being. They're interested in how much profits they can make. Does it make sense? So instead of actually choosing a funeral policy, one should look at, a structure that will enable you to save money so that if, and let's face it, a funeral is an emergency, right? If something happens to that, in line with, I must be able to actually go to my investments, draw the amount that I need, and actually go pay for the funeral. The beauty about that, and the sad part about, funeral policies is that I would be contributing this thing for 10, 20 years, and the only payout will still be that 10,000 rands that I've signed up for 20 years ago. But your contributions are likely to have been far more than the 10,000 that you're going to get out. Now picture if you had actually started an investment that would have built, with interest, so that if any emergency, not just somebody passing away, I bust my tires, what do? Instead of raising my debt again and going into that credit card and paying for my tires, I can actually go into my emergency fund and go pay for whatever it is that I need. Does it make sense? That's the crux of it. I mean, I think for me, investments, and the issue around investments is that a lot of us, we want to put away money, but we don't set up goals. If you're going to invest, you need to have goals. You need to understand why you're putting the money away. And part of that plan is also to ensure that we've calculated, issues like inflation I talked about. If I wanted to save for a plasma screen, right? And this plasma screen is 5,000 rands. It will take me, let's assume, a year or 2 years to actually get to the 5,000 rands. By the time I receive or I take out my 5,000 rands from my investment, there's a strong possibility that that plasma would have gone up based on inflation. Does it make sense? And so when we do your plans and sit down with you, we take those into account and make sure that we understand that there's an issue of inflation that we need to make sure that we're protecting against. Does it make sense? So set up goals. Have a long-term strategy and a short-term strategy. Short-term, make sure that that's your emergency fund. Long-term, I have kids. I want to make sure. The second thing that I hate are education policies. I cannot stand those things. I cannot stand them. Why? Because we take these things today, again, we don't look at the issue of inflation and the volatility within the markets. By the time my kids go to university, the money that I was saving for actually is probably only going to last them, for the first quarter, or just enough for registration. Does it make sense? Because nobody ever bothers to go back and look at the performance of this investment, right? And so we've taken on these things, and again, here's another issue. Education policies make an assumption that education is expensive at university. I'm saying in today's time, education is expensive now. If I can have a plan that would enable me to actually pay and support my kids through school based on my savings or my investments, even better. Because if I can carry that, it means by the time they get to university, in fact, it shouldn't be an issue for me paying for, it shouldn't be an issue, paying their varsity fees. Does it make sense? I'm going to try and just give you those nuggets, but for the sake of time as well, I want to sort of move, as quickly as possible. So emergency fund is important. I mean, we often say that, failure to plan is planning to fail, right? I think COVID proved us wrong, in fact. But the beauty about, I say that because, if anyone had a plan in 2019, 2020, none of those plans came to fruition. Because by COVID, because the things that we would have planned for, chances are we have had to change. But the beauty about it is that you had created a structure, so it's something that you were able to kind of, work from, and with the changes that would have come, now suddenly I can't go see clients. I have to make sure I set up virtual, meetings. People are still not understanding this, so which would have meant that my incomes would have dropped around that time, and they did. So for us, in fact, the way that we survived as a business was through the emergency fund and making sure that when I'm on the mountaintop, I put away because I know that valleys are coming. Does it make sense? That's what an emergency fund is designed to do. You put away so that, when the valleys come, you don't have an issue. I often say that, God created, seasons for a reason. Every season, the most amazing part, Kum, is that every season actually has fruit. But when we think about winter, we're often thinking, disaster. So when you talk about valleys, we're thinking disaster. Instead of actually finding the fruit for ukuphila kwakho within that time. I'm not sure if I'm making sense. I'm taking up your position as a pastor, Lwazi. But the idea is that that's what putting away is designed to do. So that you can weather the storms and make sure that you're not feeling the issue and now suddenly there's no income that's coming through because you would have made sure there's an emergency fund and you can fund your ongoing expenses. And then, of course, lastly would be estate planning, but Lwazi will talk more on the estate planning and the need to have a plan. Moving on to the next slide, remember I said I'll show you on how to structure the insurances. So number 2 for me is probably the biggest, as I had said. Why? Because you have to protect your income. As I said it, before, you've got to look at insurances, in fact, and in the form of a house. A house it's supposed to be a house. Sorry, we're not, architects, we're in finance, so that's a house. Okay. So today, that's our house. But a house has foundation, it has the body, it has the roof, right? Financial planning works exactly in the similar or in the same vein. In other words, there are things, when you build a house, you don't start with the roof, but you start with a foundation. What we deem as a foundation are the risky elements that if I don't have it, I mentioned the issue around medical aid, if I don't have it, the consequence would be, right? If I don't have an investment now, what is the consequence? Maybe I haven't saved and it's okay, right? But if I don't have a medical aid, I'm in an accident, the consequence is that I'll treat a fray. If I get disabled and I don't have a life policy, the consequence is what? That I won't have any income. Does it make sense? So that's a risk that we are looking at. And what we deem as a risk is number one, in medical aid that I've just mentioned. I won't talk more on that. I think we all get the picture. The second thing that we deem as part of your foundation is the life policy. Now, the issue with life policy is that it's always been sold as a death benefit. If I were to look at all of your life covers now, chances are there's a strong imbalance where your death benefit is sitting at 5 million, your disability is sitting at 500,000. Does it make sense? Why? Because a life policy looks at severe illness. What happens if I'm sick? And we know these stories, right? I mean, there are people that we know that have been in hospitals, and when they come out, chances are they won't be the same again, and they might lose their job, which means the income is now dropping. And if you didn't protect that income by ensuring that you have a severe illness cover, things change, and for the worse, right? And especially the issue around disability, because it's a permanent thing. And I become a dependent in my household as well. And if we were used to earning X amount, now all of a sudden it's not coming in because we didn't protect our income. And so next slide will be, most important thing in a life policy is to ensure that you've got the correct income protection. Because that's your biggest asset, right? And especially for people that don't have employee benefits. That if I die, my pensions or my employer is going to pay 3 times my annual salary, or if I'm disabled, my employer is going to pay 75% of my salary up until age 60 or 65. If you don't have that, it means you have to rely on that life cover and what you would have formed in that life policy. Does it make sense? How we actually work it out, how much is enough, is dependent on these 2 triggers. Number 1, your level of debt. And number 2, your dependence. So in other words, if I die, I need to be able to pay off everything that I owe so that that debt doesn't become a problem for abantwana that are left behind. Utata had mentioned the issue around ibhasi zayoxuthwa ngoku and blood spilling because, we didn't have a proper plan to ensure that whatever was owing is paid in full, and then 2, SLA or whatever remains must be able to sustain my kids up until, if I look at my youngest who's 3, he must survive up until at least age 24 if I'm generous. Does it make sense? So if I was bringing in at home, let's call it 20,000 rands, that 20,000 rands mustn't go down the grave with me when I die. It must still continue. My kids must still be able to, sustain ukuphila kwabo, or enjoy, in fact, the lifestyle that I would have introduced to them. Does it make sense? And that's the kind of a plan. And so this thumb-sucking, business that we do, how much cover do you need? And this is one of the biggest mistakes we make. We take these things based on how much I can afford, not based on how much I need. So in other words, here's a life policy for you, and this is how they sell it. It's going to cost you 500 rands. What cover do you, it's 5 million. It's going to cost you 500 rands. I'm like, oh, okay, 500 rands, let me take it. Who says I need 5 million rands? Does it make sense? What assessment did they do to get to that figure? I probably needed 3 million, and it would have cost me 350, which means the balance of that 500 rands that I already budgeted for could have been going towards something else. Can you see the thinking? So it is important for you to make sure that you've got a plan, and it is important for you to make sure that you've drafted. You can identify what your needs are and obviously find a solution to those needs. Then the next phase of our planning would be retirement. Can you see that we haven't even spoken about Sanlam? Sorry, my baby. We haven't even spoken about Sanlam or Mutual or Discovery, because that's not what's important. The integration model is not important to me with Discovery, that it's going to give you paybacks. That's not what's important. What's important is understanding, the structure and then finding the product that will match my needs. If Discovery is that product, so be it. Does it make sense? So don't get sold these stories that you'll have these paybacks. I'm not crushing on Discovery, but I'm just saying that people sell you these things based on, it's a beautiful car, it's got this and that, but do I really need a 7-seater? Does it make sense? When I only have, it's just my wife and I and just one child, I wish. So the next level of our planning then would be retirement. We've spoken at great length about retirement and the need to actually, structure your retirement plan. Here's what often we would do is that these products we don't review, right? We take them today and then 5 years later you're scratching around thinking, yes, this thing has been deducting for 5 years. And so insurance companies will obviously tell you that every year your policy is going to go up by a certain amount and the benefit will also, increase by a certain amount. If you've identified that you're taking this cover based on your needs that are debt and dependence, every 2 years you should be reviewing because my debt is reducing. My kids, the term that I needed, remember I said we will calculate, it's now shrinking, right? So we're calculating this need based on my child being 3 today. 2 years later, he's 5. So I don't need as much. So every 2 years, in fact, what we then do is review your portfolios to ensure that if there's a need for us to reduce that cover, you must. Do you know what I mean? So it's contrary to what insurance companies are telling you. And the other thing that we always look at is that, at retirement, suddenly I have this life policy that's I've been paying for years and I don't want to let go of this thing. Because get out of that. Get out of that mindset because your policies should be reviewed every 2 years at least, if not every year. So that and based on some companies maybe, sharpening up their pencils, if I need to change, I must change because it's a risk cover, it's not an investment. So you shouldn't have this hold on policies that it's not an investment. Get out of it. Right? I can't overemphasize that point because that's a challenge that we often find. You would draft this beautiful plan and then you show, what the person's need is and then you tell them, okay, we're going to cancel this thing because we found, that this product is going to work better for you. But I don't want to keep this thing. Why? Does it make sense? So now the reduction in premium should be assisting you to ensure that if now suddenly I've reduced my premium by 500 rands, I can take that 500 rands and actually focus on the next level of my plan. That is retirement or investments and so forth. Does it make sense? So if you picture that 15% I was talking about with my mom's payslip, if that thing was consolidated, you know what I mean? All of those levels, in fact, I'm sure Mama would have had, to enjoy the benefit of investing and so forth because there's enough. There's enough margin based on the fact that every single time we are able to kind of review and make sure that you've got products that you need now. Does it make sense? Spoke about investments as well. The difference between, the investments, you either have a term, based investment, which is the long term. So 5 years endowment policies are your term-based investments or flexible investments. Flexible is obviously in that short-term or emergency fund that I was talking about. Does it make sense? And this is why I was saying, if you understand and then maybe go back to the first slide, that our thinking is that when I receive a salary, the next level of my planning should be what? Saving. Do you remember that? Where I said you need to change it. Because it essentially says, if your structure is like that, it means you're building your house from what? The roof. As opposed to what? Starting bottom up. Can you see how now that changes? So in other words, I receive an income, I make sure that my insurances are in place, and then I can move to retirement, savings, and everything, and that's the picture, and that's financial planning. So if you look at retirement and all the other ones above, if I can't afford it, there is no risk in me. There's nothing I'm going to lose. Talk about retirement. I'm 40 this year, which means if I don't contribute towards my retirement annuity in the next year or two, nothing. I come to offer. It's okay. I can catch up at a later stage. Does it make sense? But catch up could be quite painful as well. So that's what I mean by you could always afford to put the rest of the stuff on hold if you can't afford it, but you can never put on hold making sure that you've got your risk protected. Does it make sense? I don't think we have enough time to cover the next slide on investments, but I gave you, I think an overview on how you should structure your investments. The next slide would have shown you it's something that we designed based on what I'd said earlier around making sure that my education needs for my kids are taken care of. Instead of taking an education policy, I actually have an investment that will pay out every year after the first 5 years, or rather my only waiting period will be 5 years. Okay, super. All right, just go back a little. Okay, yeah, keep it there. All right, so next one. So we then started with this thing and said, okay, take my mom's picture again. 2.5 is not a problem when you actually have a proper, when you've done a thorough sort of analysis on, I mean, if you look at my mom's situation, 15% pasal, she would have been able to do this with ease. If you take an investment, and we started off at 2.5, it doesn't have to be 2.5, but you'll see why 2.5 would make sense. We would divide it into, the two arms that I'd mentioned earlier, long-term as well as short-term, right? Long-term, 5 years, so we would take 500 rands out of the 2,500 and we put it towards an endowment policy. And that policy is going to run for 5 years. So the 500 rands doesn't have any increases every year, remains capped at 500 rands. Then the balance of the 2,000 rands will be put on my emergency fund, which is the flexible investment, right? After a year, I would have made 24,000 if I don't take interest into account. And that's where your funeral policies can come in. Does it make sense? If you think about it now, I mean, a year goes by so quickly. We're already knocking on in November. And it just feels like the other day when, we were just celebrating New Year's and everything. So you can imagine, I mean, 24,000 is enough to say, okay, if I've started this thing and I had these funeral policies, I don't want you to go back tomorrow and cancel all your funeral policies. Because the risk associated with that is that if you don't have a plan that will cover or substitute that funeral policy that you would have canceled, you will be in trouble. So there is a place for it, but short term. Don't have a long-term mindset around funeral policies. So in other words, once I've built 24,000 within the first year, it means now I can look at my funeral policies and say, okay, which one do I cancel? And I take that contribution towards that funeral policy and actually increase towards my investments. Does it make sense? Because now I can cover 10,000 rands, gamalume, or auntie, and whatever from my emergency fund. The second year, we reduced that contribution out of your emergency fund by 500 rands. And we put it across again towards long term. So we open up a second endowment policy or a 5-year policy. It will run its own 5-year course as well. And then it means now in my emergency fund, I have a contribution of 1.5. After a year, I would have made 18,000 plus anything else that I wouldn't have drawn out. Does it make sense? So from the first year, and it would have compounded with interest. So you add up all of those amounts again, it gives you an opportunity to review and say, okay, where else can I cut down? Which other funeral policy can I cut down? Because now suddenly I've got 24,000 plus 18,000. Does it make sense? And so it keeps growing just like that. And so that's how you need to do your plan. So we do this exercise all the way up until year 5. So if you roll it, you'll see year 3, reduce that 1.5 by 500 rands. We take another 500 rands that's going to run, or rather another endowment policy that will run its 5-year course as well, all the way up to year 5. So eventually on this side, there's my 2,500 rands. Can you see it? So it wouldn't have changed. So I started off with 2,500, and if you work it out, and you'll see that, in between the exchanges, that 2.5 still remains. The catch to this thing, if you move it, is that by year 5, by the end of my 5-year term, I would have nothing contributing towards my emergency fund, but I would be sitting with a pool of funds that I would have accumulated with interest over time, enabling me to do whatever emergencies that I need. The catch to this is that in year 6, year 1 is going to pay out because its 5-year term is up. Does it make sense? And if it pays out, it will pay out anything between 30,000 to 60,000. 30 is guaranteed because that's what you would have put in. So 500 times 12 times 5 is going to be 30. And if we're lucky and have, and experience a good run in the markets, if it ends up being 60,000, it means now suddenly I have an education policy, or rather I have funds that I can pay and fund for, education for my kids. And my only waiting period would have been the first 5 years. Take the 60,000 and go pay his school fees up front, and I'm done. And what I was contributing towards my kids' school fees, I'm now putting in where? towards my emergency fund again and continuing to build my emergency fund. Does it make sense? Now, because that policy has, the first one has lapsed or matured, it means now I can actually take that 500 rands and go open up a second one, or rather another one, which I will call year 6. Does it make sense? So that in year 7 or year 2 will pay, right? In year 8, year 3 is going to pay. In year 9, 4 is going to pay. In 5 is going to pay. In year 11, 6 is going to pay. In 12, 7 is going to pay. And it just keeps doing that. Sorry? No, as in it matures, so the money is now there, right? And it will pay you out. So you have a rolling stone of funds or bonus that you would have created for yourself. This is not a triple M, push us, whatever kind of deal. So I just want us to get it right that we're not trying to get numbers here. We're just simply showing you an idea of starting a good plan. Does it make sense? I don't need you to bring in 10 people for this thing to work. It's for you. And so, and that's basically bottom line and how we approach investments, right? Setting up goals and understanding why I need to put money aside. And once I achieve those goals, geez, Bob's your uncle. Does it make sense? And that's our story, and we are sticking to it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Just at the time that, wow, let's give him another round of applause. This type of advice, guys, it's really needed in our communities, because the Africans are making these companies rich because we're not investing, but we're just buying policies. And these salesmen, they know when people start work, school teachers, they visit the schools. They've got people within the schools that tell them, we've got 3 new recruits. Come, sell them the policies. Nurses, the same is happening. And it's money that people who should be using to grow, the wealth for their families. Mr. Tegeta, I think you should come, because we really don't have much time. But because he is our pastor, we can allow him to run over time.
Good afternoon, once again, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Matt. I don't know if we clapped hands for you. I was in the toilet. Okay, awesome. I see I taught you well, young man. All right, so I've got a few minutes, but I wanted Matt to do it thoroughly, because I think it's very important. I think the information that he shared with us this afternoon is quite crucial. But I'm going to be talking about estate planning, and just running through it. I think we'll have time for engagement at the end, a couple of minutes, both on the financial planning and on the estate planning side. But let me get to it. Can we skip and go? Okay, no, go to the next slide. All right, as it said there, nothing is certain in life except for death and taxes. In fact, even on your death, you get taxed. So I want to talk about that a little bit later. All right, let's go to the next slide. So we're going to talk about what is estate planning, and we're also going to talk about what the tools are that are used in the planning process. All right, so let's get to it. Estate planning, simply, slide number 13. Consists of all the assets. What's an estate, rather? Let's look at definitions, understand what an estate is. Estate basically is a combination of all your assets and your liabilities. That's simply what an estate is. So estate planning is the process of managing one's estate in a way that ensures that it is managed during life and administered at death for 2 reasons: as per your wishes, number 2, in the most efficient way. And I think there's a number 3 there, for maximum benefit of the estate owner, that is for yourself, as well as your beneficiaries, after you've passed on. So when we talk about estate planning is a continuous process. It's not something that you engage in once, but it is something that you review, like with any other plan. You have to review it because, circumstances change, things change. I know people have, a number of people have wills that they did 10 years ago, but your will that you did 10 years ago has no relevance to your current situation. In fact, I want to do a test because I remember I spoke about wills and estates about 3 years ago, 4 years ago here at the couples, and I asked just to get an indication of how many people actually have wills. And I just want to see if we've improved on that number. So if you don't mind, if you can just raise your hand if we can see, how many people have wills. Yeah, so we're like less than 5% of the room have wills. And in fact, it's consistent with what the picture is throughout the whole of South Africa because they say only 7% of working people have a will in place. Which is a bit of a tragedy because here you are, you're working your whole life, you're building up assets, you're expanding your energy and all of that. But at the end of the day, you're not putting a plan in place as to what will happen to your assets, on your demise or when you're no longer here, knowing fully well that death is coming. So it's a bit of a tragedy, so it's important, Bazalwan, we can't stress it enough. As Matt said, I know there is a thinking and a psyche that if I go and put my will in place, then, I'm signing my death warrant, as it were. But it's not the case. I mean, I did my first will when? I think I must have been about 21, 22. When I started working, I'm what now? 18? Oh. I'm 42 years old, and I'm here. I'm still here. I haven't died. I mean, I remember when I was at Abdo's, we had wills for people who were like 80, 90 years old who were still alive. So there is no such thing. But it's important, because we have a responsibility, as I said earlier on, not only to ourselves, but to our children and our children's children. There is an accounting that we're going to have to give, and I'm putting a bit of pastoral issues here. At the end of the day, when you stand before the Father, how you stewarded your life. What did you do with the resources that God put in your hand, with the life that God gave you? How did it impact those who are around you and those who came behind you? Very important. So it's a continuous process. Number two, and it's most effective when attended to by a team, including experts from the legal, tax, and financial advisory fields. So it's a multidisciplinary approach, and I think that's how, and that's why it works, the beauty of the system that we have, because you would sit with Meatok and with Zizo on a financial planning side, to ensure that you put your systems in place, and then you shift over to me, or sometimes it works the other way around, where you shift over to me and say, okay, fine, now you've put those in place. Now, what plan do we put together to ensure that those are safeguarded? To ensure that you are able to protect those assets in the event that something happens. And because life is risky, life is a risk. Jesus Christ says himself, in this world you will have trouble, but take courage, for I have overcome the world. So the reality is that risk is there, and we have to plan for that risk. Some of us are in business. Some of us, are exposed to various challenges from a financial point of view. From business itself is risky. But we are able to put systems in place to ensure that we guard against that risk. If things were to happen, that we are able then, to have a protection for the family. Some people, are married in community of property, but they lead risky life in the sense that they're in business. I've just changed for 2 doctors now their marriage system from in community of property to out of community of property. For that sole reason, because we've got to put Mtunzi here who will sue you for medical negligence and take everything, so it's very important, to understand your level of risk, and there are different products to address each level of risk. So it's very important. Number 2, next slide. So there are a number of tools that we use in estate planning, just put them all up. So we look at wills, we look at trusts, we look at the choice of the marital regime, we look at donations and how you can utilize donations to get a tax, from a tax point of view. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Then we can also look at about the choice of the business vehicle that you use. And then number 6, the financial devices that Matt spoke to. So those are the tools that we utilize in the estate planning process. There are a number of others, but for the purposes of this meeting, those are the ones that I'm going to bring to the fore. And I'm going to dive deeper in just 2. As I said, important, a will, very important. What does a will do for you? It speaks for you when your voice can no longer be heard. It speaks for you when your voice can no longer be heard. It makes your desires known, what you wanted in terms of what should happen to your assets. But I think even more importantly, what you wanted for your children. You know, how did you want to take care of your children when you're no longer around? There is an issue that arises, an issue of guardianship, because someone has to look after them if it so happens that both you and your spouse are no longer around. You know, so it's very important to build that into the will, and we'll get into some concepts a little bit later on, but let's move. So 70% of working South Africans die without a will, and only 7% of working South Africans actually have a current will that's in place. All right, let's move. Let's talk about some concept. Okay, we have, number 1, what is called the freedom of testation. So basically, when it comes to a will, you have a freedom to determine what you want to happen to your assets when you demise. As long as that is not contrary to, you know, the moral standards of society and it is not unlawful. You know, so it's, you have that freedom to determine what happens to your assets. On the other side, if you die without a will, it's going to be determined for you. There is a law called the Interstate Succession Act, which determines what happens to your estate if you pass on without a will. All right, I want to talk about a usufruct and a fideicommissium. These are Latin terms. What a usufruct basically is, if you have a spouse, you're married, you know, and you want to leave your asset perhaps to your children, but at the same time you want to take care and safeguard, you know, your spouse, you can have a usufruct provision in your will, basically saying that on my demise, yes, I'm passing this asset on to my daughter Ulimi, but I want Usoso to be taken care of. She will have a right of use of that asset until, you know, she passes on. So that's what we call a usufruct. You're also able to determine what happens to an asset 2 generations down the line. And we do that through what is called a fideicommissium. Basically saying that on my demise, this asset will go to B. When they pass on, that asset will then pass to C. So to a certain extent, you are able to reach into the future, you know, and ensure that, you know, your wishes are carried forth. Number 3, if you're a business owner and you have shares in a company or you have a member's interest in a close corporation, you need to make provision for that. Because the reality is that if I pass on and I'm a director at Maypac Estate Planning and I'm a shareholder, you know, that asset is an asset in my estate. Those shares are an asset in my estate. So if I don't put a plan in place, those may devolve upon my wife also, who might not obviously have the technical acumen, you know, to do what I was doing here. And that might create a challenge, you know, for the business. So it's important, you know, when you're having that setup and to understand that, you know, you put a plan in place that will safeguard not only those remaining behind, but those you are involved in commercially as well. You know, then that's where we come and we talk about buy and sell agreements. Buy and sell agreements is basically an agreement that we put in place as shareholders to say, on my death, you know, the shares will be sold to so-and-so. Then Matt comes in and ensures that, provides provision for money to be paid out to buy those shares. So we deal with those issues there. So I'm just giving you a glimpse because many people, as we've seen from the room, don't really understand what goes into a will. It's not only about assets. And I get this a lot where people say that, I mean, I don't have anything, you know, so why should I do a will? But you have children. You know, you have, you know, maybe you're in a business, you know, so there are many aspects, there are many things that go into it. It's not just about, you know, being a millionaire and, because abantu bathi iwili, abantu banamali. But it's not correct. That's not entirely true. All right, you can also put in your funeral directions. I put in some there, what I want to happen to me when I pass on. Number one, akuzubakho umthandazo kwam from Monday until Friday, and then my family while mourning, they have to feed everyone who comes every evening. So I seriously put that in there in my will. Number two, I want to be cremated. So you're able to put that. But even before perhaps you die, some people, you get sick and maybe you're in life support. So we can have a living provision, what is called a living will part of it, where you can determine that, look, if a push comes to a shove and the only thing keeping me alive is life support, hey, I give my family the authority to switch the machines off and leave my life in God's hands. So you are able to cater for those things, because those can be traumatic events for your family, because now they can be caught between a rock and a hard place, not knowing what decision to make in the situation. So you can preempt that by putting that in a will. All right, as I said, for minors, okay, when it comes to children, you can have guardianship provisions, because what happens is that because the natural guardians of a child are both parents. So if both parents are no longer there, then a guardian needs to be appointed. If you haven't made a provision in your will for appointment of a guardian, because the guardian is there to make major decisions as it concerns to your children's schooling, as it concerns, to their medical treatment, not everyone can make that decision. You can't rely on your relatives if you have not made provision for it in your will. Now, the beauty about putting it in your will is that if you have put it in your will, you will save your children, your family members, the hardship of having to go to court. Because you have to go to court to get yourself appointed as a guardian if you are not appointed in terms of a will. Now, that could be a costly exercise. Maybe business for Uputim Tunzi, but you can avoid giving him business if you put it in a will. And you make sure that your children are taken care of in that regard. Also, if you leave inheritance to your children and you have not, let's say you didn't have a will in place, so your estate is then left to your children, and if they're minors, that will be paid into what is called the Guardians Fund. Now, the Guardians Fund is a government-run institution. So you understand that story. I don't have to elaborate. It becomes very challenging for those who are left behind to, manage those children, because every time they have to go to the master of the High Court in Grahamstown, where the Guardians Fund sit, and say, okay, money was left to so-and-so, we need money for school fees and so forth. You have to complete forms, you have to wait for responses. It becomes a frustrating situation. I remember my secretary at Abdo and Abdo, Vanessa, had the same story, where the father of the child left. The son was the only sole beneficiary, because I think they were divorced at the time, and the money, he couldn't receive the money because he was a minor, and the money was paid into the Guardians Fund. So every year, and as go January, it's a stressful time for her, because she has to run around and try and access these funds, or the phone 100 times, and it's really frustrating. So you can avoid those kind of scenarios by making sure that you plan well for your children. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I'm speaking double time here, but I hope that we are following double speed. All right, so there's a cost that is attached to death. Put them all up. So when you pass on, there are a number of costs that are associated with the event of death. Number one, executors' fees. So when you pass on, someone has to manage your estate. Someone has to make sure that your estate, is distributed for the rightful people. So the Administration of Estates Act has provisions of what happens when a person passes on. How do we clean up their estate and give it in the hands of the rightful people? So for doing that, an executor is entitled to charge you 3.5% of the gross value of your estate. All right? So it's important that you make provision for those fees. And in that exercise, when they do the financial needs analysis, a provision is made, to cover those fees, because those fees can be quite, excessive. Sometimes it happens that because there's no liquidity, there's no money in the estate, we're having to sell an asset. Either we sell an asset or the beneficiaries have to pay in, so that those fees are covered. But if you do a proper financial planning, you can ensure that those, taken care of. Number two, the master's fees, where the estate is reported, 7%, up to 7,000, can be payable in respect of master's fees. Number 3, capital gains tax, SARS. It comes knocking. Because the tax laws will tell you that when you pass on, that is what is called a deemed disposal of your assets. In other words, it's taken as if you have sold your house, or you've sold your piece of land, and then capital gains tax may become payable. As the word suggests, capital gains tax is basically, you pay tax on the gain. So if you bought a property 10 years ago for R1,000,000, and when you pass on 5 years down the line, it's 1.5 million, the gain would be 500,000. So you then pay tax. I think the marginal rate is 18%, or the inclusive rate for tax is 18%, if my memory serves me. 18%, right? Yeah. So on that, yeah. So your estate will then have to pay tax. Then we also have estate liabilities, which is basically if you had an account, you had a credit card, whatever debt that you had within your estate, those have to be catered for before any distribution is done, to your beneficiaries. So within that financial needs analysis, we look at obviously what your debt exposure is, and we make provision for that also, within your life cover calculation and determination, so that when something happens, that gets paid out, and then we pay the debt and so forth. Here's something that's important. It's very important also to ensure, because sometimes we will put in our policies beneficiaries as being A, B, and C. But we leave no money, because when you pass on and your policy pays out directly to that person, no money comes directly into your estate. But then you still have to pay estate fees, there's still liabilities. So we make sure that a percentage of that life policy, maybe 5, maybe 10, depending on how big it is and how big your estate is, gets paid into your estate. So you become a beneficiary. So that money is there. There's liquidity in the estate to avoid us having to sell the assets to ensure that those costs are paid. Now, if you're married in community of property, it's also a cost on death in a sense, in that when you're married in community of property, you have what is called a joint estate, eyam eyakho, eyakho eyam kind of scenario. So when you pass on, because your spouse is a joint heir, we first have to shift 50% of what the joint estate value is to the spouse, and then the remaining 50% will be determined by the provisions of your will if you have a will, and if you don't have a will, by the provisions of what we call interstate succession. All right, next slide. Iyavakala bazalwane? Awesome. Yeah. All right, I just want to give you here as a comparison between what we call testate and interstate succession. Testate succession is when you pass on with a will. Interstate succession is when you pass on without a will. So here are just a bit of a differences. In testate succession, when you have a will, you're able to choose the executor. It's your choice who you want to be the executor of your estate. But interstate succession, the master will appoint an executor for your estate. Your family members may do what are called nominations, or they may nominate someone. But the point is, you don't have control over the process. So someone perhaps that you didn't really like might be appointed to deal with their assets, at the end of the day, and someone that you might not even trust to have the best interests of your loved ones, in place, may be appointed. Number 2, so you decide who to leave your assets to, but on the other hand, the distribution is per the Interstate Succession Act. So there is a formula there that says if there's a spouse, this is what's going to happen. If there's a spouse and children, this is what's going to happen. If there's only parents, this is what's going to happen. So it's predetermined, so you have no control over the process. Number 3, having a will provides stability and continuity for loved ones. Because one of the things that it does, when you sit down and you really think about the process, you are able to put things in place to ensure that there is stability. But if you just leave it open-ended, there is a high possibility of liquidation of assets, because you won't think about, okay, now my life cover, do I have enough life cover to ensure that my liabilities are paid? So you won't go through that process. So sitting down with an estate planner, sitting down with a financial advisor allows you, to go to those uncomfortable places, which we need to go, and to think of the different various scenarios and make sure that you put a plan in place to ensure that those scenarios are mitigated or they are dealt with in a way that will benefit your beneficiaries. Number 4, You can create what is called a mortis causa for trust. That's another thing, to help your children. Because obviously, if your children, when you pass on, they are not mature enough to receive the inheritance. We've all seen what happens in society when children at a young age or at an immature age where they receive inheritance and they just splurge it, and in 3-5 years' time, everything is gone. So in order to circumvent that, you can have what is called a trust provision, where a mortis is actually a testamentary trust that is created in the will, and you appoint trustees. These are people who will manage the inheritance on behalf of the beneficiaries. So it can be family members that you trust, and as a third person, you may put your attorney also there as an objective person, and they will manage the estate for the benefit of the children until a stage when you have set in your will, maybe you think, okay, the age of 25, they will be mature enough to be able to handle the inheritance. The other alternative, of course, we talked about the Guardians Fund earlier on. And the last difference there is that generally it's quicker to wind up an estate that has a plan, that has a will, and we know what to do. Sometimes it can take years. I know of a number of estates. There's one that I dealt with when I was at Abdo in Abdo many years ago, I think about 10 years ago. That estate is still pending until today. So the beneficiaries have not received their inheritance because there was no will. And only to find that, this old man, had a number of children all around the show. So now we're going to court. So now we're contesting paternity test, this, that, and the next thing. So there are a number of things that can come into the picture that can delay the process. But if there is a structured plan in place that says, okay, A, B, and C, awesome. It's much easier. It can take between 6 to 18 months to finalize an estate, which is another thing that we must bear in mind, because what happens then in the meantime to your children? What happens to your spouse in the meantime? That's where the planning comes into place, the financial planning, that we make provision for even when we're busy administering the estate, at least there is money that is coming through that will take care of their needs. I was asked also to touch a little bit on trust, which is the second tool. Let's go slide. So basically what is a trust? A trust is a separate legal entity. It can own property, it can be sued or sue in its own name, and is subject to taxation. It is formed in a will or through the drafting and registration of a trust deed. So basically, as the definition states, it's a separate person. You can think of it in a sense. But the definitions say it's a legal arrangement. But let's think about it conceptually as a person. So it's basically a person that you create, and you appoint trustees to manage the trust fund. So what you can do then, let's say you're in a high-risk career, maybe you're a business person. You can transfer or even buy assets under the trust to ensure that they are, closed off from asset protection. For asset protection purposes, if business goes down, they chase you, after you, they can't touch those assets because they are where? They are in the trust. So that's what we call a living trust, or what is called an inter vivos trust. So inter means during vivos, life. So during the course of life, you can create that trust and appoint trustees, and you can even be a beneficiary of that trust yourself. All right, so that's why we would use a trust. Next. Okay, I talked about that. Inter vivos trust, trust during life. Testamentary trust is a trust that is formed in the will. Testament, obviously, last will and testament. So at the time when you pass on, that trust is created to take care of your children. But there's also another interesting concept called a mortis causa trust. So it's a trust that is formed in anticipation of death. It's becoming quite popular these days because you find there are a lot of people who are suffering all of a sudden, I don't know, from mental illness. So when you find yourself in that position, because you don't know then what happens when you get to a point when you can no longer take care of yourself. So you can form that trust and appoint trustees in anticipation of that condition. Of course, we will pray, we'll fast, but things happen sometimes, but it's wisdom to plan. It's wisdom to plan. And they ask you sometimes, yes, voted too much. But the practical reality is that things happen at moment and you have to plan for those things. So I think my last slide, and then we can get a quick Q&A. The general benefits of a trust, I talked about asset protection. Number 2, perpetual succession. So even if I pass away, it doesn't impact those assets because they are no longer in my estate. So they can go from my children to my grandchildren to my children's children, because I put as beneficiaries in my trust my children Ulimi noNcali plus their descendants. So even when they pass on, those assets continue down the line. Here is another thing from a tax point of view. There is a tax called estate duty. I didn't put it there. That's another tax that is payable upon death, 20% of anything that is over 3.5 million rand. So you can use a trust for tax efficiency purposes, because once I've got the asset out of me, if I pass on, it's not impacted by estate duty. And a lot of people who buy properties in their names, and they will have like 5, 6, 7 properties. But here is the thing about property, of course, it's a good investment, but it has tax consequences because it appreciates in value. So it could happen that when you pass on, your property portfolio is worth, 20 million rands, for argument's sake. And then that becomes subject then to estate duty tax. And Jude will tell you, he worked for SARS, he knows the tax issues. And that can be a very heavy tax. So you can save that, and as Matt said, leave something behind for your beneficiaries instead of giving that to the tax man. Because when you pass on, if your asset is under the trust, it doesn't affect or it doesn't come into the picture when it comes to estate duty. I think last one, wealth creation. It's a wealth creation vehicle for generations to come. And I think that's it from my side, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.